The air in our neighborhood always smells like fresh-cut grass and laundry sheets, the kind of suburban perfume that's supposed to convince you everything is perfect. We live in one of those developments where the houses all look slightly related, but try their best to have their own personality, much like the people living inside them. My name is Elena, and for 7 years, my house was my sanctuary. I'd spent countless weekends painting the nursery a soft, muted sage and obsessing over the exact shade of navy for the kitchen island. Mark, my husband, used to joke that if I spent any more time at Home Depot, they'd start charging me rent. He was a high-level project manager for a construction firm, always busy, always on his phone, but he always made time to kiss me before he left for the site. At least, he used to. Everything changed about 6 months ago. It wasn't a sudden explosion, it was a slow leak. Mark started staying later at the office, citing a massive downtown development project that was behind schedule. When he was home, he was a ghost. He'd sit on the sofa with his laptop, the blue light reflecting in his eyes, while I sat 3 feet away feeling like I was trying to reach him through a soundproof glass wall. I tried everything. I cooked his favorite meals, I bought new lingerie that stayed tucked away in the drawer, and I tried to initiate conversations that didn't revolve around the mortgage or our daughter's preschool schedule. He was just gone. That's when I started spending more time with Sarah. She lived 2 doors down in a sleek, modern farmhouse-style place that always looked like it belonged in a magazine. Sarah was everything I felt I wasn't at that moment, vibrant, unbothered, and seemingly possessed of infinite well of empathy. She was a freelance interior designer, which gave her the flexibility to have long, wine-soaked lunches on her back patio while our kids played in the sprinkler. We became fast friends. It started with borrowing sugar and turned into 4-hour venting sessions about the invisible weight of being a suburban wife. I remember one Tuesday afternoon vividly. The sun was hitting the patio just right, and the chilled Sauvignon Blanc was doing its job of numbing the ache in my chest. I told her everything. I told her how Mark hadn't touched me in weeks. I told her how he hid his phone under his pillow like it was a state secret. I even told her about the night I cried in the shower so the kids wouldn't hear me, feeling like I was losing the man I'd built my entire life around. Sarah sat there, her manicured hand resting on my arm, her eyes filled with what I thought was genuine sorrow. She told me I was a queen, that Mark was an idiot for not seeing what he had, and that men like him often just needed a wake-up call. She encouraged me to keep pushing him, to demand the attention I deserved, while simultaneously validating my fear that he might be pulling away for good. She was my lifeline. When Mark would come home late and barely onto hello, I'd text Sarah. She'd reply instantly with, "I'm so sorry, babe, you don't deserve this. Come over for a drink?" And I would. I'd sit in her kitchen, surrounded by her expensive candles and minimalistic decor, and I would pour my heart out. I told her his schedule, I told her his favorite drinks, I told her about the little things he liked, like how he hated the sound of the dishwasher at night, or how he preferred his coffee with exactly 2 sugars and a splash of oat milk. I thought I was sharing my life with a sister. In reality, I was giving her a roadmap. The first time I felt a flicker of doubt was at a neighborhood block party in July. It was a typical American summer scene, grills smoking, kids running around with orange-stained fingers from Cheetos, and a cooler full of local craft beers. Mark was actually there, looking more relaxed than I'd seen him in months. I saw him talking to Sarah near the drink station. It looked innocent enough. They were laughing. Sarah had this way of tossing her head back when she laughed that made her long blonde hair catch the light perfectly. I felt a tiny pang of jealousy, not because I suspected anything, but because she was getting a reaction out of him that I hadn't seen in half a year. I walked over, and the second I approached, the energy shifted. Mark's smile didn't disappear, but it tightened. Sarah, ever the professional, just looped her arm through mine and told Mark he was lucky to have a wife who looked so good in a sundress. Later that night, Mark was unusually attentive. He actually asked me about my day and held me for a few minutes before falling asleep. I felt a surge of hope. I texted Sarah the next morning. "Whatever you said to him at the party worked. He was actually present last night. Thank you for being such a good friend." She replied with a simple heart emoji and told me she was glad things were looking up. I felt like I finally had an ally in the trenches of my marriage. I didn't realize she was the one digging the holes. August was a blur of heat and escalating suspicion. Mark started taking client calls in the garage. I'd see the light on at 11 p.m., the silhouette of him pacing back and forth. When I'd ask who it was, he'd give me some vague name like Miller from the plumbing subcontractor or the zoning guy.
I wanted to believe him. I desperately wanted to believe that our life wasn't falling apart. Every time I felt my resolve weakening, every time I thought about grabbing his phone and demanding the passcode, I'd talk to Sarah. She'd tell me to stay calm. She'd say, "Don't be the crazy wife, Elena. That'll just push him further away. Be the cool, collected woman he fell in love with." She was playing both sides of the board. Looking back, the signs were everywhere, hidden in plain sight like a magic eye poster I couldn't quite focus on. I noticed she started wearing a specific perfume, a spicy, woodsy scent that Mark had once mentioned he liked on a character in a movie we watched. She started randomly showing up at the local coffee shop right around the time he'd stopped by on his way to the office. She even started asking me more specific questions about our private life. Not just, how are things, but is he still sleeping on his side of the bed? Or does he talk about work projects when he's home? I thought she was just being thorough, making sure I was okay. I didn't realize she was checking her progress. The breaking point for my ignorance came on a Thursday night. Mark was supposedly at a late-night site inspection. Sarah had told me she was going into the city for a gallery opening. I was home alone, the kids were asleep, and the silence in the house was deafening. I decided to take a walk to clear my head, the humid night air clinging to my skin. As I looped back around our cul-de-sac, I saw a car parked a block away from our street. It looked like Mark's silver SUV, but it was dark, and I told myself I was being paranoid. Every silver SUV in the suburb looks the same. But then I saw a figure step out of the passenger side. It was a woman. She was wearing a silk slip dress that shimmered under the streetlights, the exact dress Sarah had shown me online 2 weeks prior, asking if I thought it was too much for a date night with her on-again, off-again boyfriend. She didn't see me. She leaned back into the car, and for a long, agonizing 5 seconds, she stayed there.
When she finally pulled away, she was smoothing her hair and laughing that same light, melodic laugh I'd heard 1,000 times over wine on her patio. The car drove off, and she began the short walk to her back gate, humming to herself. My heart wasn't just breaking, it was being ground into the pavement. The woman I had trusted with my deepest insecurities, the woman who had watched me cry and handed me a tissue, was the one feeding on the remains of my marriage. I stood there in the shadows, my phone heavy in my pocket, feeling the cold realization wash over me that I wasn't just losing my husband, I had been hand-delivering him to my neighbor. I didn't move for what felt like an eternity. The crickets were screaming in the bushes, a rhythmic, pulsing sound that felt like it was drilling into my skull. I watched Sarah disappear behind her side gate, the latch clicking shut with a finality that made my stomach heave. I stood there in the dark, my sneakers damp from the dew on the grass, feeling like a fool. No, not just a fool. A curated project. She hadn't just been my friend. She had been a predator studying her prey, and I'd given her the internal monologue to my entire life. Every insecurity I'd confessed, every fight Mark and I had, every little preference he had, I'd handed it all to her on a silver platter. I walked back to my house, my legs feeling like lead. When I stepped into the entryway, the silence felt different. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a sleeping home anymore. It was the suffocating stillness of a crime scene. I went straight to the kitchen and poured a glass of water, my hand shaking so hard the glass clinked against my teeth. 10 minutes later, I heard the garage door mumble open. The sound used to bring me relief, a signal that my partner was home safe. Now it sounded like a warning bell. Mark walked in through the laundry room, tossing his keys on the counter. He looked tired, but there was a strange brightness in his eyes, a lingering energy that didn't match the exhausting site inspection story he'd been peddling for months. He saw me standing there in the dim kitchen light and jumped slightly. He asked why I was still up, his voice casual, almost practiced. I looked at him, really looked at him, and noticed a smudge on his collar. Not lipstick, Sarah was too smart for that, but the faint, shimmering dust of her highlighter, the same rose gold glow she'd bragged about buying during our last trip to the mall. I didn't confront him then. My throat felt like it was lined with broken glass. I just told him I couldn't sleep and went upstairs, lying in bed with my back to him, staring at the digital clock as the minutes ticked by. 3:14 a.m., 3:15 a.m. Beside me, Mark fell into a deep, easy sleep, his breathing steady and untroubled. I realized then that the man I shared a bed with for nearly a decade was a stranger, and the woman 2 doors down was the architect of my misery. The next morning was a blur of caffeine and performative normalcy. I packed lunches, kissed the kids goodbye, and watched Mark drive off in that silver SUV. The second his taillights disappeared, I felt a wave of cold, calculated fury replace the grief. I wasn't going to just cry. I needed to know how deep this went. I needed to see the receipts. I knew Mark's iPad passcode. It was our wedding anniversary, a detail that felt like a slap in the face now. He usually kept it in his home office, but it wasn't there.
I checked the living room, the kitchen drawers, and finally found it tucked under a stack of magazines in the guest room. My heart was hammered against my ribs as I typed in the numbers. 0612. The screen flickered to life, showing a photo of our family at the beach last summer. We looked so happy. I felt a sob catch in my throat, but I pushed it down. I went straight to the messages. There were no threads with Sarah's name. My heart skipped a beat. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I'd hallucinated the silk dress. But then I saw a contact named Construction Supply Co. It was pinned to the top. I opened it, and the world tilted on its axis. It wasn't about plumbing or drywall. It was a digital diary of betrayal. The messages went back months. They were graphic, intimate, and devastatingly casual. "I love the way you look in that green sweater," he'd written on a Tuesday, when I told Sarah I was feeling bloated and ugly. "She's complaining about the kitchen remodel again. God, I just need to be with someone who doesn't need so much," he'd sent after a dinner where I tried to talk to him about our future. Sarah's replies were even worse. She didn't just flirt, she dissected me. She'd take things I told her in confidence, my fears about my career, my struggles with postpartum depression years ago, and use them to paint me as a burden. "She's just so heavy, Mark," one message read. "You deserve lightness. You deserve someone who sees the man you are now, not the man you were 10 years ago. Come over after she goes to bed. The back door is unlocked." I sat on the floor of the guest room, the iPad glowing in my hands, reading the play-by-play of my own undoing. They had joked about me. They had laughed at my cluelessness. Sarah had even texted him a photo of us having wine on her patio with the caption, "She has no idea. It's almost too easy." The betrayal wasn't just sexual. It was a total assassination of my character. She had used my friendship as a scouting mission. Every time she'd encouraged me to give him space or be the cool wife, she was clearing the path for herself. She was coaching me on how to lose him so she could win. I spent the rest of the day in a trance. I went to the grocery store, I picked up dry cleaning, I waved to the neighbors, all while carrying the weight of 1,000 leaden secrets. I saw Sarah's car in her driveway. For a split second, I wanted to drive my minivan straight through her front door. I wanted to scream until my lungs gave out, but I knew that wouldn't work. If I went in hot, Mark would just call me unhinged and dramatic, exactly the way Sarah had characterized me in their texts. He'd have an excuse to leave, to run straight into her waiting, light arms. I needed a different plan. I needed to see them together. I needed a moment so undeniable that neither of them could gaslight me out of it. That Friday, Mark told me he had a networking mixer downtown. He even put on the cologne I'd bought him for his birthday, the one he used to save for our anniversaries. He kissed my cheek and told me not to wait up. I watched him leave, and 10 minutes later, I saw Sarah walk to her car, wearing a dress that cost more than my monthly car payment. She looked radiant. She looked like a woman who didn't have a care in the world because she'd successfully stolen someone else's. I didn't follow them, not yet. Instead, I called my sister and asked her to take the kids for a sleepover, telling her Mark and I were going to try for a date night to fix things. Once the house was empty, I went into Mark's closet. I found his old GoPro, the one he used for mountain biking, and I tucked it into my bag. I knew where they were going. I'd seen a reservation confirmation for a high-end bistro in the city on his iPad. I drove into the city, parking 3 blocks away from the restaurant. I sat in my car, my hands gripped so tight on the steering wheel that my knuckles were white. I felt like a spy in my own life. I waited.
About an hour later, they walked out. They weren't hiding. They were walking down the sidewalk, Mark's arm draped heavily over her shoulders, her head resting on his chest. They looked like a couple. They looked like they belonged together. I followed them at a distance, my heart echoing the sound of my footsteps on the pavement. They didn't go back to their cars. They walked into a boutique hotel 2 blocks away. I watched them check in, saw the way Mark touched the small of her back as they waited for the elevator. It was so domestic, so casual, that it hurt worse than if I'd caught them in a dark alley. I walked into the lobby after they'd gone up. I knew the desk clerk wouldn't give me a room number, so I sat in the bar area, hidden behind a large potted palm, and waited. I pulled out my phone and checked the iPad's Find My feature, which I'd spent the afternoon syncing to my phone. A little blue dot pulsed in the center of the hotel. Room 412. I didn't go up. I couldn't. Not yet. I sat in that bar, ordering a drink I didn't touch, and watched the elevator doors. I realized that my entire life, the house, the sage green nursery, the 7 years of us, was being incinerated in a room 4 floors above me, and the person holding the match was the woman I'd called my best friend. I took out my phone and sent Sarah a text. "Hey babe, I'm feeling really down tonight. Mark is at that mixer and I'm just spiraling. Can I come over for a drink? I really need to talk to someone who understands." I watched the screen. 1 minute, 2 minutes. Then the bubbles appeared. "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry. I'm actually stuck in the city at that gallery thing I told you about. It's running so late. I'll come over first thing tomorrow morning, okay? Hang in there. You're so strong." I stared at the message. The sheer, unadulterated gal of it. She was probably lying in his arms while she typed that. She was probably showing him the text,
both of them laughing at how strong and pathetic I was. I felt something in me snap. The sadness was gone, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. They wanted a show? I was going to give them one they'd never forget. I wasn't just going to end my marriage. I was going to dismantle the fantasy they'd built. I got up from the bar, walked out of the hotel, and started making a list. I had the iPad, I had the texts, I had the room number, and I had a neighborhood full of people who thought Sarah was a saint. The drive back from the city was the longest 40 minutes of my life. The freeway was a blurred ribbon of red and white lights, and I felt like I was hovering somewhere outside my own body, watching myself steer the minivan through the suburban night. My mind was a high-speed reel of every girls' night Sarah and I had shared. I remembered her holding my hand when I cried about Mark's distance. I remembered her telling me to treat myself to a spa day, which I now realized was just a coordinated effort to get me out of the house so he could slip into hers. Every piece of advice she'd given me was a tactical strike. I didn't go home. I pulled into the driveway of our mutual friend, Beth, who lived at the entrance of our subdivision. Beth was the neighborhood gossip, the woman who knew whose marriage was on the rocks and whose teenager was sneaking out the window. Usually I found her exhausting, but tonight she was exactly what I needed. I knocked on her door at 10:30 p.m., looking like a ghost. When she opened it, seeing my tear-streaked face and the iPad clutched to my chest, her eyes widened. I didn't lead with the tears. I led with the evidence. I sat at her granite kitchen island and laid the iPad flat. I scrolled through the construction supply co messages. I showed her the photos Sarah had sent Mark, photos taken in her bedroom, in her car, and one even taken in our own guest bathroom while I was downstairs making dinner for the kids. Beth's jaw literally dropped. She wasn't just shocked, she was horrified. She had been the one to introduce Sarah to the neighborhood garden club. She felt the personal sting of the deception too. I told Beth everything. I told her about the hotel, the silk dress, and the text Sarah had just sent me while lying in my husband's arms. I watched the fire of indignation light up in Beth's eyes. This was the currency of our neighborhood, and Sarah had just committed the ultimate inflation of trust. By the time I left Beth's house an hour later, I knew the word would spread. By morning, the social fabric Sarah had carefully woven around herself would be shredded. But that was just the social death. I wanted the personal one. I went back to my house and started working. I didn't pack a bag for myself. I packed for Mark. I went into our master closet, the one I'd organized with such pride, and I pulled out his suitcases. I didn't fold anything. I shoved his suits, his expensive Italian shoes, his gym gear, and his electronics into the bags with a frantic, jagged energy. I felt like I was purging a virus. I dragged the suitcases down the stairs, the wheels thumping against each step like a heartbeat. I hauled them across the lawn in the dark. Our neighborhood is quiet at night, the street lamps casting long, skeletal shadows across the manicured lawns. I walked up Sarah's driveway. Her house was dark, still radiating that smug architectural perfection. I left Mark's suitcases right in front of her designer front door. Then I went back for the rest. I took his golf clubs, his prized espresso machine, and even the world's best dad mug the kids had given him, which felt like a lie too heavy to keep in my cupboards. I piled it all on her porch. I stood back and looked at the mountain of his life sitting on her doorstep. It looked like trash waiting for pickup. I went back inside and sat in the dark living room, waiting. I didn't turn on the lights. I just watched the street through the slots of the blinds. Around 1 a.m., the silver SUV pulled into the cul-de-sac. It didn't pull into our driveway. It slowed down and crept toward Sarah's house. I felt a fresh wave of nausea hit me. He wasn't even coming home first. He was going to her. I watched as he parked a few houses down to be discreet. He walked up her driveway, his head down, probably checking his phone for one last message from her. He reached the porch and stopped. I couldn't see his face, but I saw his body language stiffen. He stood there, staring at the pile of suitcases and gear. He walked forward, touching one of the bags as if he couldn't believe it was real. Then the porch light snapped on. Sarah had clearly heard him. She opened the door, wearing a silk robe that matched the dress from earlier. I watched the pantomime of their panic through the window. She looked at the bags, then at him, then frantically scanned the street. Mark was gesturing wildly, pointing toward our house. He took a step toward our driveway, but then he stopped, realizing the door would be deadbolted. I picked up my phone. I had drafted a mass email to our entire neighborhood association, the social committee, the safety watch, the book club. I had attached screenshots of the construction supply co-texts. I had attached the photo of them walking into the hotel. I looked at the send button. My finger hovered over it. If I hit send, I was nuking my own life too. I was making my private shame public.
I was making sure my children would eventually hear the whispers. But as I looked at Sarah, standing on her porch, trying to help Mark drag his suitcases into her house to hide the evidence, I realized the shame wasn't mine to carry. It belonged to them. They had built this monument of lies, and I was just the one providing the light so everyone could see it. I hit send. Almost instantly, I saw lights flick on in the house across the street, then Beth's house. The digital forest fire had started. I walked to my front door, unlocked it, and stepped out onto the porch. The air was cool now, the humidity finally breaking. Mark saw me. He froze, a suitcase in each hand, looking like a caught animal. "Elena," he called out, his voice cracking. He started walking toward me, leaving the bags on her lawn. "Elena, let's talk inside. This isn't what it looks like. I can explain everything." Sarah was standing in her doorway, her face pale. She didn't look like a queen anymore. She looked small. She looked like a neighbor who had been caught stealing mail, only worse. She tried to catch my eye, to offer that practiced look of concern she'd used so many times before. "Elena, honey, you're upset. You're not thinking straight." "I'm thinking perfectly straight, Sarah," I said, my voice surprisingly calm. It was the loudest the neighborhood had ever been in its silence. "I'm thinking about how much you like the rose gold highlighter you bought at the mall. I'm thinking about how you told me Mark needed lightness while you were planning our divorce for us. And I'm thinking about how everyone on this street just got a very detailed look at your design process." Mark reached the edge of our lawn. "Elena, please, think about the kids. Don't do this." "The kids are safe with my sister," I said, stepping back into the doorway. "And they're going to stay there until I figure out how to tell them their father and his friend decided to play house behind their backs. Don't come in, Mark. The locks are changed, and the lawyer has the iPad. You can stay with Sarah. After all, you're exactly what she wanted." I shut the door and turned the deadbolt. The click was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. I walked to the kitchen, leaned against the counter, and finally, I let the first real sob out. It wasn't a sob of grief. It was the sound of the glass wall finally breaking. I was standing in the wreckage of my life, but for the first time in 6 months, I could finally breathe the air. I heard his muffled shouting from the driveway, followed by the sound of Sarah's door slamming shut. The neighborhood was awake now. I could see the silhouettes of people in their windows, phones in hand. The perfect suburban life was gone. But as I looked around my kitchen, at the navy island and the sage green walls, I realized they were just colors. They weren't a home. A home was built on something they didn't have. I sat on the floor and pulled my knees to my chest. I had won the battle, but the war of rebuilding was just beginning. I knew there would be a part 4 to this. The legal filings, the custody battles, the awkward glances at the grocery store. But tonight, I just wanted to sit in the truth. The sun came up the next morning with a cool, indifferent brightness. I hadn't slept a single second. I'd spent the hours between the confrontation and dawn sitting on the floor of my daughter's room, surrounded by stuffed animals and the lingering scent of lavender laundry detergent. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the two of them on that porch. The frantic, ugly scrambling of two people who had spent months pretending they were superior, only to realize they were just common. By 8 a.m., the neighborhood was vibrating. My phone was a glowing brick of notifications. Texts from women I barely knew, emails from the PTA, and several missed calls from Sarah. I didn't open any of them. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what the narrative was now. The perfect neighbor had been outed as a homewrecker, and the quiet husband was the villain of the cul-de-sac. I felt a hollow sense of satisfaction, but it was quickly replaced by the daunting reality of what came next. Revenge is a high that crashes hard, leaving you with the same broken house you started with. I walked to the kitchen and made a pot of coffee, my movements mechanical. I looked out the window and saw Mark's silver SUV still parked down the street. He was sitting in the driver's seat, his head resting on the steering wheel. He looked pathetic. He didn't look like the high-powered project manager or the charming guy who could fix anything. He looked like a man who had traded his entire world for a few months of lightness and was now realizing the weight of the debris. There was a soft knock at my door. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. If it was him, I wasn't sure I could keep my composure. I looked through the peephole. It was Beth. She was holding a tray of muffins and a thermal carafe of coffee, her expression uncharacteristically somber. I opened the door just a crack. "I'm not here to gossip," she said, and for once I believed her. "I just wanted to make sure you'd eaten, and to tell you that the locks on Sarah's side gate are being changed today." Her landlord saw the email.
Apparently there's a morality clause in her lease or something about disturbing the peace. She's being asked to leave by the end of the month. I took the tray from her, the warmth of the muffins seeping into my cold hands. "Thank you, Beth, for everything." "We're all behind you, Elena," she whispered. We had no idea she was that calculated. After she left, I sat at the kitchen island, the navy blue island I'd picked out with Mark, and I started making a list. Not a grocery list, but a life list. Step 1, lawyer. Step 2, therapy for the kids. Step 3, figure out how to explain why Daddy's suitcases were on the neighbor's lawn. The legal process was a blur of fluorescent lights and mahogany desks. My lawyer, a shark of a woman named Diane, didn't care about the emotional betrayal. She cared about the construction supply collogs. Since Mark had used a shared family cloud and a shared iPad, the privacy argument was thin. We had the hotel receipts, the GPS tags, and the sheer volume of messages where they discussed hiding assets or planning trips using our joint savings. Diane called it a gift-wrapped settlement. Mark tried to fight it at first. He sent me long, rambling emails about how he was lost and how Sarah had manipulated his midlife crisis. He tried to blame the stress of the downtown project, the lack of intimacy in our marriage, the pressure of being a provider. I didn't reply to a single one. Every time I felt a flicker of the old Elena, the one who wanted to fix him, who wanted to believe his excuses, I just reread the text where Sarah called me heavy. That word was my armor. The real ending didn't happen in a courtroom, though. It happened 3 weeks later, on the day Sarah moved out. I stood on my porch, a cup of tea in my hand, watching the moving truck back into her driveway. It was a gray, drizzly Tuesday. The perfect suburban house looked cold and empty. Sarah was loading boxes into her car, her hair unwashed, her designer clothes replaced by a faded sweatshirt. She looked like she had aged 10 years in 3 weeks. She saw me. For a moment she stopped, a box of kitchenware in her arms.
She looked like she wanted to say something, to apologize, to justify, to throw one last barb. But then she looked at the houses around us. Every single neighbor who happened to be outside, the guy mowing his lawn, the woman walking her dog, stopped and stared at her. Not with anger, but with a cold, silent judgment. She was a pariah in the kingdom she tried to subvert. She tucked her head down, shoved the box into her trunk, and drove away without looking back. Mark moved into a small corporate apartment near his office. He gets the kids every other weekend, and the silence in the house when they're gone is still hard to get used to. He's tried to ask for coffee dates to discuss closure, but I've kept every interaction strictly through a co-parenting app. I realize that closure isn't something he can give me. It's not a conversation or an apology. It's the absence of his noise in my head. I spent the following Saturday repainting the kitchen island. I chose a bright, clean white. As I rolled the paint over the navy blue, I felt a strange sense of peace. I wasn't painting over the memories. I was just reclaiming the space. The house didn't smell like grass and laundry sheets anymore. It smelled like fresh paint and new beginnings. I'm not the same woman who cried in the shower 6 months ago. That woman is gone, buried under the weight of the betrayal. But the woman who emerged is stronger, sharper, and far less inclined to give her heart to anyone who hasn't earned the right to see it. I still live in the same development, but it doesn't feel like a sanctuary anymore. It feels like a territory I've successfully defended. Last night I was sitting on the patio, the same spot where I used to pour my heart out to a snake in silk clothing. The sun was setting, casting long golden shadows over the lawn. I looked over at Sarah's old house. A new family is moving in next week, a young couple with a toddler and a golden retriever. I thought about whether I should go over and introduce myself, maybe bring a plate of cookies. I decided I would, but this time I won't be telling them my secrets. I'll be listening. I've learned that in this neighborhood, the most dangerous thing you can give someone isn't your husband, it's your truth. And my truth is finally mine alone to keep. I took a sip of my wine, looked at the empty house 2 doors down, and smiled. The lightness Sarah promised Mark had turned into a void, and the heaviness she accused me of had become my foundation. I walked back inside, locked my door, and for the first time in a very long time, I slept through the night.